Landmarks. I'm Erik Spanberg, in for Mike Collins. Charlotte's got a lot, not when it comes to historic preservation. As all of us who live here learn quickly, Charlotte remains obsessed with its growth and its future, and not much interested in its past. Despite those hurdles, there are many people in town who want to hang on to as much of the city's history as possible. Such concerns have surfaced again in recent months with the uncertain fate of the Excelsior Club. Located on Beatties Ford Road, the Excelsior closed in 2016, and to survive, it needs both a new owner and extensive renovations. During the era of the segregated South, it became the hub of African American culture and politics, hosting performers such as Louis Armstrong, James Brown, and Nat King Cole, among others. Joining me today in studio to discuss the Excelsior and the larger issue of historic preservation are Eli Portillo, Assistant Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships at UNC Charlotte's Urban Institute. I got to take a break after that. I got to take a breath. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for being here, Eli. Dan Morrill, who is Consulting Director at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And also from the UNCC Urban Institute is David Walters, who is an architect and contributor, correct?
More or less.
Yes, and he understands cricket, so we've got all bases covered. See what I did there? Baseball, cricket? Okay. So before we get into the broader subject of local preservation, I want to begin by getting a sense from each of you about why the Excelsior Club is such an important landmark and what you think its future may be. So Dan Morrill, let's start with you.
It's an icon. It's an icon of something that is fundamental to our society in the 20th century and has particular meaning to the African American community. The African American community talks about the movement, and they have seen, of course, a broadening and enriching of their experiences culturally, and the Excelsior Club was a place, even in the days of segregation, where they could go and feel welcome. That was not true of many, many places in the South in the days of racial segregation. The memories are deep. You know, they're names that, nobody knows today. Coleman Carey, who was a major figure, the Alexander brothers, Fred Alexander, who was the first African-American on the city council. It goes on and on. It's the story that is so iconic for large segments of the community. And it's amazing how important that memory is for many in this community.
Now, David, before I get to you, Eli, I want to ask, because Eli obviously recently left the Charlotte Observer, and you had covered both development and politics. So I'm wondering from your vantage point what the recognition is of the Excelsior Club in the broader community from what you've seen and heard.
I think it's certainly been raised a lot in the past few years as its future has been in question. It's gone from being something that part of the community knew about to really a broader issue that is iconic in some ways of Charlotte's attitude towards historic preservation as a whole. We've seen so much growth and development and new construction in this city that we've torn down a lot of what's here. And I think that this particular issue and this particular building has struck a chord because we are perhaps at an inflection point in this city where people are stepping back and saying, wait a second, we've already seen so many older buildings torn down. Are we going to let that happen to this one as well? So in some degree, I think it's accumulation and an encapsulation of the broader struggles around historic preservation that come in such a fast-growing city that has historically been obsessed with growth, new, shiny, more buildings, what's next, what's next, what's next.
And I should mention that the Excelsior Club is under contract right now with a potential buyer from California, but a lot of this urgency was created by the fact that the current owner, who is State Representative Carla Cunningham, has said she doesn't have the money to restore this. There was a moratorium on demolition that expired in June, so there are a lot of things happening at once. Before we delve into that a little deeper, I want to ask you, David Walters, you're an architect, if I can say the word, you're an architect and an urban planner. From your vantage point, what's the most useful way to preserve this building and get use out of it, assuming that someone comes to the rescue?
we've already used the word icon and iconic, and that makes, I think, us think about the value of buildings which are that bit more special than the average. We don't want to forget about the average stuff, which is really important to preserve and work with. But because the Excelsior is such an icon, even to me as an Englishman who has to learn all this stuff, it is clearly much more than a building. It's a home, a house of memory, and any architectural work to redevelop that, to work with the past to create a new future, obviously has to be very sensitive. There are a lot of pragmatic issues about building code, all sorts of things which would mean, one, expense, but also gives a good designer the opportunity to work with the old and bring in the new. That, in other cities, we have plenty of people who are used to working with that. Not so much here, although we're learning, but keeping old and bringing the right kind of new in with it to make a dynamic thing. I don't think we'd want to pickle the Excelsior Club in Aspic and say, that's it. That's what you do with incredibly old special things that are going to fall down if you don't take care of them. We've got to find a way of bringing new life to make new history, overlaying but not obliterating that.
Could I follow up on that a minute?
Yes, and by the way, Dan, this building dates to, it opened in 44.
It was a house that was built in the 20s.
Okay, 20s.
And then it was converted to the club. I couldn't agree with David more. The issue is, what do you mean by preservation? Now, I would say the most important thing about the Excelsior Club, and I'm speaking individually, is the memory has to be kept alive. The iconic memory needs to be kept alive. And one has to think imaginatively about what is the best way to do that. If you look, for example, at a full restoration of that building, which, let's face it, was essentially functioning as a place during the era of legal racial segregation, where African Americans together to hear music, to dance, to have a good time. Happily, legal racial segregation is no longer with us. Also, the economics, the sheer economics of fully restoring that building might be prohibitively expensive. And so the issue is, for example, if you take a city like Charleston or you take a city like Savannah, let's talk about King Street in Charleston. Many of those buildings have an original historic facade, which has been maintained. It's a new building behind. And I'm not saying necessarily that that's what has to be done with the Excelsior Club, but it's got to be something that makes sense. I don't mean sense. I also mean sense. It's got to make sense. And so I concur completely with David that it's a matter of creative energy and creative thought to think about how to keep that memory alive.
Eli, you had a thought?
So at this point, we still don't know what the prospective buyer's plans for the building are. That hasn't been disclosed. And the latest, though, is that the city is still discussing if there's a way for them to get involved in this. At the Economic Development Committee meeting last week, Councilmember James Mitchell was very enthusiastic about finding some way to get the city and the county to team up. He said, this is not a done deal. This is something that we should maybe consider as a public good still. We shouldn't necessarily say, okay, there's a private buyer, we're done. And according to a city-sponsored survey of residents in the area and other people who are interested in the club's future, one of the popular possible uses was a museum of history. I don't know if that would fit into this idea of something that makes sense and brings new life, because I think that gets to the heart of some of the questions around historic preservation, which is this something that's just about history and what happened in the past, or as David and Dan have suggested, is this about bringing new life and new uses that dovetail with the past. So I think whatever happens with this building, that's going to continue to be an issue of how we work with the past. Do we just preserve it and say this is a museum about what happened, or is there more of a dynamic new business, maybe something that brings it forward into the future more?
Well,
Eli, you get a gold star for that because that's the perfect setup. Let's hear what Councilman James Mitchell said last week at that meeting.
So let me share with the committee. I have spoken with the owner. It's on the market now for $1.5 million. Don't know what the California is offering, but there is some feeling that if the city and the county were to make an offer, that would look very favorable.
So, and another thing that Councilman Mitchell said at the meeting last week, and some other council members brought up, is this idea of whatever's going on with the California buyer, we don't know if the building would be preserved. We don't know what that buyer would want to do. So I think that's some of what's driving this local government interest.
I talked to the realtor, and I think I'm going to have an opportunity to meet with the realtor within the next week to explore some of these very ideas that David is talking about. And I can tell you what the realtor could say. It is under contract. It is not closed. Due diligence is going on. Because this building, due to the efforts of a very dynamic new local preservation group, Preserve Mecklenburg, was placed on the most endangered list by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the realtor told me that the buyer is committed to preservation. Now, that goes back exactly to what David was talking about. What do you mean by preservation? Now, clearly, if the private sector, and I'll express a bias, speaking individually, I think the private sector is always going to have a real dynamic approach to properties, which somewhat draws me to it. I think that the issue is going to be, what do we mean by preservation, and what will the new buyer be willing to do? Now, if the city and county get involved, that's great. But let me tell you one thing about museums. I'm not opposed to museums. I think they're great. They all need ongoing subsidy to survive. They are not self-supporting.
David, you have about 45 seconds to sum up the history of the world.
The key difference here is between preservation and adaptive reuse. That's a bit of a jargony term, but it means taking an old building and breathing new life into it with new uses. Whether a museum might be part of it, but I think it's got to be a dynamic mix of things. There's no single one use that one could find that'll sort this out. What that might be, I think, should be part of a large sort of outreach. But ultimately, if the private sector's involved, it's going to make money out of this. And that's how adaptive reuse works. It's taking the past, respecting it, and building on it to create a future.
We have a future, and our future is to take a break. But when we come back, we're going to talk more about the Excelsior Club and historical preservation. Stay with us right here on Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Corkscrew Wine Shop and Bar, located at the View near BB&T Ballpark in Uptown Charlotte, and at Brookdale Village in Lake Norman, offering wine and beer from all over the world. Relax, uncork, unwind. CorkscrewWinePub.com. And the Charlotte Symphony Southern Pops celebrates America July 3rd with patriotic favorites and fireworks at Symphony Park. Grounds open for picnicking at 5 p.m. Concert begins at 8:15. Tickets at charlottesymphony.org. Democrats are hoping that in 2020 they can pierce the Republican Party's stronghold on voters in the South. The region's political allegiances shift generations ago from Democrats to the GOP in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, the result of what history has come to know as the Republicans' Southern Strategy. Two experts on Southern politics trace the origins of this tectonic shift when Charlotte Talks tomorrow at 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
Millions of dollars in aid has been approved by Congress to go to the U.S.-Mexico border. How much will it help with the growing humanitarian crisis there? From overcrowded detention facilities to overworked border agents, where is Washington on policy to address America's strained immigration system? Dispatches from the southern border next time on 1A.
1A coming up from 10 to noon right after Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins, and we're talking about the Excelsior Club and historical preservation. And joining me in studio today are two members of the UNCC Urban Institute team, David Walters and Eli Portillo, and also from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission, Dan Morrill. When we stepped aside, we were talking a little bit about finding uses for the Excelsior Club and defining preservation. I want to go back for a second, Dan, to what you were mentioning about talking to the realtor. I think the price is $1.5 million, or that was the price that it was put on the market for, right?
Obviously, the realtor could not tell me
Yeah.
what it was. 1.5 million is what the realtor said was the sales price.
Okay.
That's correct.
And earlier, Representative Cunningham had turned down offers of $800,000 and $1 million. At least that's what was discussed at council. So what I was going to ask you is, do you think there's any way the city could get the city and the county, if they made an effort, if they made a joint bid, are they going to get this for anything less than $1.5 million, do you think?
Well, the only thing I can say is in all the dealings that I had with the owner, Carla Cunningham, she always characterized herself as a businesswoman who would make a business decision, and I think she believes that in view of what's happening in the Beatties Ford Road corridor, that $1.5 million is a fair price. And to answer your question directly, I have no idea what the city and county can get.
David, I want to ask you about the architecture piece of this. The building itself, obviously there is all the history that is very valuable to the community, but in terms of the building itself, what strikes you about it?
It's interesting that there's usually one photograph that tends to summarize the building, and there's the one that's used in the media, and it's a perfectly fine photograph. That captures the notion that the image of the building is almost as important as the actual stuff that it's made of. So whatever happens, any design would want to preserve that image. I mean, this may be a case where something from the past is actually kept like that. But what happens inside or what happens behind, your observation, Dan, about what happens in Charleston and many other cities, you preserve the public face of the building, and then what happens in the private realm of ownership behind. And I'm sure that kind of equation about what pieces of this building really belong, in quote marks, to the public, that's the external, particularly the front facade, which everybody knows. I don't know how many people alive today have spent much time inside the building. I certainly haven't, but I've worked with old buildings even back to the 1400s in the UK, and there's often not a lot of stuff left you can work with on the inside. You're left with key elements that capture, visual clues that capture the history. So at a very broad brush, I would say we'd keep the front facade, we'd make sure that that was in perfect condition. We would establish some kind of context in the public street outside, because there is going to be a streetcar going past before too long, so that the building will have a new life in a new era for Beatties Ford Road. What happens inside, I think that's where we need all the ingenuity for new uses, new architecture, to have some kind of dynamic interior which plays between old and new, memory and future. Architects who know what they're doing love this kind of stuff.
I want to broaden the conversation a little bit. And Eli, you mentioned early on that Charlotte has always been a place, or has long been a place, where shiny and new are the ultimate goals. Any theories as to why Charlotte has been so particularly egregious when it comes to preserving these historic properties?
Well, if you go back and look at Charlotte plans from decades ago, plans about how the city would grow and how businesses would be attracted to here, you can find a lot of the same language you hear today. Back to the beginning of this city, it was city leaders were very interested in bringing new business, growing, competing with other metro areas. But I think part of the story is that for a long time, Charlotte was significantly smaller than a lot of the cities that we think of now as sort of really well preserved and great examples of adaptive reuse and historic preservation. In 1850, population-wise, Charlotte had about 1,000 people, roughly. That same year, according to the 1850 census, Charleston had 43,000, Philadelphia had 121,000, Boston had 137,000. So, Charlotte was a small village at the time when a lot of these cities were bustling metropolises of their day. So we start with a smaller base of historic buildings. I also think that it's important to note that a lot of the notable buildings we've lost, things like the Hotel Charlotte, imploded for a David Copperfield TV special in the 80s. You should go watch it on YouTube. It's pretty wild. The Independence Tower, the Masonic Temple, which was really striking, right at the corner now where a Wells Fargo building is. A lot of those buildings, when they were torn down, they were maybe 70, 80 years old. They were seen as, if you read the media accounts of the day, kind of past their prime. Maybe they'd been closed for a while. They were seen as seedy. So they weren't seen by a lot of people in the city as something worth delaying any of the growth for. It was, hey, we can have a new office tower there with new jobs, tear it down. That was the prevailing notion from a lot of people in the city. It makes me think, what are we doing that with now that we're going to look back in 30 years and say, ooh, maybe we should have kept that one?
David Walter? Oh, I'm sorry, Dan Morrill, go ahead.
I hate to disagree, but I think Charlotte's done a better job than a lot of people think about preservation. First of all, when you think about preservation, it's more than buildings. I'm as interested, for example, in the countryside, in the landscape, as I am. If any of you have ever been to Macaulay Road, which is incredible in North Mecklenburg, where they've got a 1.4-mile gravel road that's still preserved, and it's almost like going into Amish country. And also, if you look around, look at what's the North Carolina Music Factory in? It's in an historic building, the old Ross Mill, where they made asbestos, by the way. Look at Noda. You've got, the Heist Brewery, which is in Highland Mill number 3. You've got the Mecklenburg Mill, which has been converted into affordable housing. The Historic Landmarks Commission. And the Historic Landmarks Commission is a public body, been in existence since 1973, and it's done a remarkable job. NODA I could go on and on. The Atherton Mill, I could go on. It's when a lot of people think of historic architecture, they think of urban centers. They think of Mobile. They think of Savannah. They think of Annapolis. They think of Wilmington. In that sense, largely because there's been so much money to make by using dirt to go as high as you can, we have lost an enormous amount in the center city. But the first thing I was involved in, and I would ask you this question, how many cities do you know that have a place like Fourth Ward in the very center of it? How many do you know that have a neighborhood of that distinction? So I think this notion, the Historic District Commission's been, the real weakness, in my opinion, of our preservation movement in Charlotte-Mecklenburg is a business-friendly, real estate active, private, nonprofit preservation group that has a revolving fund that buys properties or secures easements on properties, like the Historic Savannah Foundation or the Historic Charleston Foundation. The private sector is really what has made those cities be what they are, and that's what we need here.
The fact that I can say Eli is perfectly correct and Dan is perfectly correct shows that we're in the midst of a huge change, I think. People in my generation, educated in the decades after World War II, we were taught that the past was not worth preserving, particularly in Europe. We'd had 2 world wars, we'd had desperate situations, we'd had terrible slum housing, disease. Who wanted to go back to that? The whole thing, I was educated to make a brave new world. I was educated to actually tear buildings down and build new stuff, and I'm absolutely typical of my generation. Then something happened in the 70s and 80s when we began to think, hold on, that we've shifted now, and that's why Eli's right, because the whole ethos for, and still, people active in development and design and real estate, they come from a training of make it new. New is always better than old. But we've got this understanding now, and Dan is right, because there's an enormous amount of ordinary older buildings being preserved. I mean, when my wife and I drive our cat to the vet, the poor cat's not very well, but, yes, sympathy, thank you. But the vet is in a sort of slightly dodgy area, and it's surrounded by 1950s buildings, which are now little brick boxes being refurbished. Developers are pouring tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars into ordinary buildings. This is in Lower South End. And those ordinary buildings, to me, clearly one of those is not in the same league as the Excelsior Club. But when you get a group of those, they hold their own piece of history from the 50s and 60s about the manufacturing growth that began to push Charlotte forward. People are finding value in those old buildings. And so, yes, the iconic stuff is very special. It deserves the best thinking and the best treatment we can possibly have. But we also need, and we are doing a lot of this, taking care of the ordinary old stuff. Because even that stuff is built in ways that we don't build today. Like thick brick walls, big roof trusses. We don't build that way. Just watch an apartment building going up. It's all made of matchsticks because that's the cheapest and most effective and highly engineered way of doing it. So there's value. There is value in history. And I don't want to monetize it in that sense, but buildings don't get preserved unless they have an economic future.
By the way, that's the voice of David Walters. He is obviously a native of Clemson, South Carolina. And he's also
you guessed.
he is also with UNCC's Urban Institute. Eli Portillo from the UNCC Urban Institute is also with me, and Dan Morrill from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. I think one of you mentioned the Polk Building, or referred to the Polk Building being demolished for a luxury apartment project. That's shocking to all of us who live in Charlotte.
By a former student of mine.
So, but that does also tie to this discussion about preserving facades, perhaps, and then doing other things with a building. I think that was suggested by at least a couple of people. Why do you think that didn't work out in that particular instance, and why have we been less willing to do that than some other cities?
Well, that particular building, I think the answer is both simple and complicated at the same time. The simple answer is that the building fabric, the stonework, the timber, had just decayed. It had been let go a shockingly long time. And that's a story in itself, which I'm sure Dan knows a lot more about than I do. But, it's in a prime site, and I know studies were done to save at least the facade, because you can't do much with a rotten interior. You've got to rebuild it. But that one had been let go. And Dan, I'm sure you know the story about why that wasn't more proactively saved, quote unquote. But once a building reaches a certain point, unless it's got the iconic value and unless the public in some way is willing to step up and subsidize a little bit of history. I mean, so much of the old preserved buildings in Europe have some public subsidy underneath them. And, most of the work is done by the private sector, and that's often brilliant. But it can't always carry the load on its own.
Well, I agree with that. the years that I've been involved with the Historic Landmarks Commission, by the way, I'm going to be leaving the commission this year.
Are you allowed to do
After
that?
46 years. And the primary reason is they need somebody younger. I'm an old man. But also, I want to really devote myself to this new Preserve Mecklenburg business-friendly group. But what I have found, the political will, the political support, when it comes to actually making the decisions, which are fundamentally budget decisions, simply does not exist in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. It is, I've often said support for historic preservation in Charlotte-Mecklenburg is a mile wide and an inch deep. And if anything else competes with it, it loses. And, David, I know that you're saying, and Eli, both of y'all are interested, what makes a great city? Well, history's not the past. History is us today thinking about the past, reflecting upon the past. The future's the most important thing because that's where we get hope. But every great city that I know, the cities that are intriguing to me, are multi-layered. Mm-hmm. They have a sense of continuity between past, present, and future. And that's what makes a great city to me, is that mix.
And I think that's one thing that makes losses like the Polk Building or the Query Spivey McGee Building, which was on Stonewall Street, and now there's going to be a luxury hotel and office tower built there. Those buildings were, both kind of nondescript in a lot of ways. The Polk Building in particular had been allowed to decay, but they were part of the fabric of the city that was here before. And I think that's what's concerning when you see all of these, ordinary buildings that aren't shockingly old or incredibly, iconic for a history reason or, particularly striking architecture. They're all pieces of a fabric, and, picture a tapestry with holes eaten in it by moths. Eventually, you lose so much of it that you can't tell what was there before.
There's a very, very important reason to take care of those old buildings that Eli's just described, and that's because they offer cheap, if not dirt cheap, but cheaper space for small companies, for entrepreneurs. This is happening a lot in Lower South End and parts of the West End. If you're a startup business, you're looking for somewhere cheap and cheerful, where you can meet people. I mean, the whole notion of the collaborative workspace is with us, I think, for a while. But that really needs characterful history. If you live in a historic building, adapted for the present and looking at the future.
Hold that thought. I want to get back to that. Stay with us. We're talking preservation in Charlotte with the Excelsior Club and other properties. You're listening to Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Blumenthal Performing Arts, presenting Hello Dolly, starring Betty Buckley at Belk Theater, July 9th through 15th. Tickets at 704-372-1000. And Levine Cancer Institute, part of Atrium Health, dedicated to bringing care and treatment to the Carolinas, offering access to current clinical trials and 200 cancer doctors at more than 25 locations. Atrium Health. Coming up next on 1A, the pressure on the U.S. government to address the humanitarian crisis at the southern border has intensified over the past several weeks. Where is Congress on an immigration policy that will address the current crisis? What is the right way to handle what's happening at the border? And can anything be done about what's behind the surge of people migrating to the U.S.? Joshua Johnson and his guests discuss on the next 1A. Coming up next at 10 here on 90.7 WFAE.
With the 2020 election approaching, Morning Edition shows you the view from here, there, and everywhere. We take you across the country to explore different issues and understand the voices behind the votes.
I'm Brian Baxt in St. Paul.
Kelsey Snell, NPR News, Crew, Virginia.
I'm Josh Rogers in Concord.
Mara Liasson, NPR News, Washington.
Travel somewhere new with Morning Edition from NPR News.
Listen each weekday morning from 5 to 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins, and we are discussing historic preservation in Charlotte. That is not an oxymoron, Dan Morrill assures us. And Dan Morrill from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission is here with us, and also two members of the UNCC Urban Institute. We have David Walters and Eli Portillo. Before we went to the break, David, you were explaining a little bit about how older buildings can really help with entrepreneurship, incubators for new companies. Tell us a little more about that.
Well, I mean, I'm fortunate enough, my wife and I are fortunate enough to be part of a co-working group in Southend, so we spend a lot of time inside buildings which were built as distribution warehouses, common brick boxes with a nice bow truss roof. We don't build like that anymore, so you walk in there and you think, wow, this is pretty cool. And we've still got, I won't say a lot, but a substantial chunk of buildings like that, which now, I think Dan has made this point before, the development community recognizes now that this is worth something. People value even a slice of prosaic history. I mean, I work in a building, my wife paints in a building that once just had stuff in it and semis backed up, and people move stuff from the building to the semi. I mean, it's a pretty pragmatic thing. But the building shell from those activities in the 50s, 60s, and 70s have left both that memory, which is valuable, but also a new canvas. You know, one of the most wonderful things is for an architect is not starting with a blank site. Starting with stuff that's there, and you've got to respond. You've got to think about the actual fabric, the built stuff, then the meanings behind it, the history. And then you say, okay, what can the present lay on to this so that the future can grow through it? Now, that's a bit sort of romantic, I know, but it's actually how we should think about it. And I know there's a lot of folks in the design professions now who think that way.
Well, and it seems to me, Dan, this is getting to several of your points. Your first point about the political will not being there could be moved by this private sector view of finding new ways to use what were prosaic buildings and getting new life out of them. And then if you have an economic case, it seems, particularly in Charlotte, but in most places, if you have the economic case, it's much easier to get things done politically.
Well, whatever time I've got left, I mean, let's face it. The Landmarks Commission is a wonderful organization. It's done a wonderful stuff. But if you designate something as a landmark, it can still be torn down. A lot of people think, well, if you make it a landmark, it can't be torn down. The Charlotte Historic District Commission, Davidson has a district commission. They do great work. But the same thing is true there. If the owner wants to turn it down, at the most, they have to wait a year. And then they tear it down. We're facing that with a major house over in Plaza Midwood. And it is true the Landmarks Commission has a revolving fund, but I don't need to tell you how much legislative complexity comes when you're using public money. I mean, it is very, very, very intricate. What we have to have, if we're going to have a viable, ongoing preservation movement with the dynamic nature that David and Eli are talking about, is a group like Preserve Mecklenburg. It is a group that is private, nonprofit, can buy any building, can buy a less than fee simple interest in any building, a background building, one that the semi-truck comes into. And if we are able to work with the owner, or if we're able to buy it, we can put preservation easements on that property, and then it can't be torn down.
Now,
that's what's got to happen.
Now, a historic building is technically defined as 50 years or older. Is that right? Or is there a technical?
There's no mandatory age. It could be something last year. If it was deemed to be of sufficient historic significance to justify.
I think your point about urban centers, I think that's how a lot of us look at whether a city has its history or not. I'm just curious, when you look out at the B of A headquarters or you look at the NFL stadium, something like that, in 30 years, do you think those buildings will be here? I guess the NFL stadium's a really tricky question, but do you think those buildings will be here, and would the city suffer a great loss if they weren't here?
Well, the issue is it should be a deliberate decision. Sometimes it's important to remove things. You can't put everything in the attic. You can't live. There's some things you got to throw away, but it ought to be a deliberate decision. You just don't do it unknowingly, not even being aware of the history or the commitment that it can make to the future of the city. It's a matter of thinking. It's a matter of being creative. David said what he was talking about was romantic. Well, I love romance.
Let the record show Dan Morrill loves romance. Eli, go ahead.
I think that a lot of times it's difficult to predict what will be something that we value as a quote-unquote historic building in the future. When the Masonic Temple, which if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to search for pictures of that. It's this, beautiful building, unlike anything that's in Uptown now, Egyptian revival from, I believe it opened in 1921.
They tore that building down to build a vacant lot.
Yes, there's still a plaza there. But
it's shocking.
At the time, I actually went back and looked at news coverage from when it opened. At the time, there were speeches about how this is a building that will stand for decades, for eternity, to mark mankind's friendship. That was gone inside of 7 decades. A lot of these mills that are from about the same era, now, I'm sure when they were built, they were nothing special. They were, distribution centers. They were places where people worked to earn a living, spinning fabric. And now we value them as these wonderful historic buildings. So a lot of times it's really tough to predict what will stand the test of time and what will not.
Let me get to a listener comment. This is from Gil on Facebook. He says, I absolutely love Charlotte, but that's probably my biggest beef with the city, mowing down these historic buildings with no regard of its significance, and that once it's gone, there's no going back. I really hope this changes. Dan, you seem like you're optimistic that things are not as dire as some of us believe.
Well, there's no future in pessimism. It's all about hope. It's all about optimism. If this community will take advantage of the fact that we have a very vigorous public sector preservation movement, if we can get a very active private preservation movement, then we've got a full team to work on this.
Let me ask all of you about something that kind of ties into this idea of preserving history beyond just the buildings, and that is there were reports in recent days about a revival of the Coffee Cup restaurant, and anyone who lived here at the time that the Coffee Cup was knocked down knows there was a lot of angst and hand-wringing when that happened. It was a company called Beezer Homes on West Moorhead Street. They knocked down this restaurant that was really one of the few gathering places for black and white and higher class and lower class, and really brought the community together. And then Beezer Homes essentially fell apart, and the project was never built, and so there is still a flat piece of land over there that's now owned by, who owns that, Eli?
Is that Pipe and Foundry?
Yes, thank you, Charlotte Pipe and Foundry. I should know that since I covered the football stadium speculation. But anyway, what I was going to ask is, when you have something like the Coffee Cup, it may come back, but obviously it's not going to be in the same place. It won't be in the same building. How much or little does that do to bring that history back to our community?
It's better than it not coming back. And like most things, it depends how it's done. That example is why people like your caller buy into the common perception that we trash our history, because that's an absolute example of the private sector just not caring. A better developer would have captured the value of that by preserving it, designed a new development that put a public space next to it so that the town, the city, could celebrate it. I mean, look where it is, across from the Panthers. I mean, there's 90,000 people across the street. Sometimes, and I totally agree with Dan that the private sector is a crucial component of this, but most of the problems, most of the publicity that we get, the bad publicity, is frankly that the private sector just doesn't care. There's significant moneyed players for whom history is still a problem. Charlotte used to just want any developer to come in and build stuff. We're actually working out of that now we want the good developers. And we are, there are some really good developers in town who get tarred with the brush of the bad developers. It's not fair. But that Beazer Homes encapsulates the stupidity and greed of private sector players who have destroyed a lot of Charlotte. The public sector's destroyed stuff too. Nobody's blameless. But that little coffee cup, that's a microcosm of why we think we trash history. And all the good stuff of converting, adaptively reusing stuff in Southend, that doesn't get press.
Those are the words of David Walters. He is with the UNCC Urban Institute. Eli Portillo, also from the UNCC Urban Institute, is with us, and Dan Morrill from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission, and we're talking about preserving local history. I wanted to ask each of you, going back to the Excelsior Club, one of the things that really got this conversation started was it was included on the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Endangered Places list earlier this year. If there was a similar list, and going back to Eli's point, it's hard to know what is going to be valuable to us in the future. But if there was such a list for local properties beyond the Excelsior Club, what would be on your list? Are there a couple of properties that you look at and say, we really don't want to lose this one or that one?
Well, I'm not going to pick a specific one, but I do think one thing that we really need to focus on is mid-century modern architecture. I think about, structures of note that were designed by people like JNPs. I'll give you an example. Down at the corner of Moorhead and South Tryon Street, there's now a car rental place, which was designed by JNPs and Associates, won a preservation award. JNPs Jr., by the way, was a wonderful man. He had a great laugh. I've always loved people that laugh. And that's really a significant building. I mean, that would be an interesting exercise, but I would focus on mid-century modern.
David?
That's that's an area in need of care, certainly. And so I agree with Dan. I think we don't want to fall into a trap of picking, and not that Dan is, but we don't want to fall into a trap of picking stuff and, rather than say, oh, that one and that one. I think we've got to talk in terms of historic periods. That one thing we've got great historic neighborhoods, the streetcar neighborhoods. We are blessed with some of the finest examples in America. Architectural historians come to look at Dilworth in Myers Park because they're so special. We live in them, we're lucky, and that's just how it is, right? So mid-century modern is I'm older than mid-century modern, so I deserve to be preserved as well. So is Dan. He's older than I am, so he gets there first. Put a plaque on me. Put a plaque. But the idea that we look at areas of Charlotte, because one of the things that Charlotte is doing its comprehensive plan process, we would have to have some serious thinking in that comprehensive plan about the role of history in historic preservation, so that the Dilworths in Myers Park were built in the teens, in the 20s and the 30s of last century. So what we built in the middle of the century, what we're building at the end of the century, the comprehensive plan goes to 2040, so 50 years is 1990. So 1990 is going to be historic in some senses.
And I'll be historic.
Yes, yeah, join the club, Eli.
We'll put a plaque on Eli, too.
Yeah, but we've got to look at periods of our history. And as the suburbs change and evolve, we want to, capture the sense of what it was like to live here in the 50s. And as the suburban revolution liberated the middle class to buy property and own their stuff, and that, although we're learning now that the way we design suburbs is problematical, that's part of the history too. So the adaptive reuse, not just of buildings, but of whole sections of the city. And that's part of the comprehensive plan. It's Dan's point. Preservation is about looking at the future.
I don't mean to be critical of anybody, but, my experience of going down to the planning department, if you come in with a creative idea, they have this notebook, and they start flipping through this notebook. And basically that notebook tells you why you can't do something, particularly if it's off the menu.
So there's no a la carte at the Planning Commission?
That also, I think, there is some dynamic new folks. There are some dynamic new folks at the Planning Commission, and, I've had that experience that Dan has. And, there's a core of people there who are trying to craft the right kind of regulations, the right kind of book that'll welcome innovation. And by golly, we're going to stick to that.
Well, we'll stick to that. You get the last word. Eli Portillo and David Walters from the UNCC Urban Institute, Dan Morrill from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. Thank you all for the hour. This has been Charlotte Talks on WFAE.